Good afternoon, everyone. The topic of my talk is standardization of Chinese characters for computer use in Hong Kong. I'm giving this talk because actually I work as a under one ISO standardization committee, consolidating all the Han characters, or we call them ideograph characters, for inclusion in the ISO 10646, which is commonly known now as Unicode. And so this is the work that we have done with the Hong Kong government on standardizing the Chinese characters in Hong Kong. Firstly, everyone knows that Hong Kong is a bilingual society. Sometimes we want to say that we're trilingual because the Cantonese as a dialect is different from Mandarin. But the written system is basically two, English and Chinese. And Hong Kong uses the traditional Chinese. So the first computer that comes into Hong Kong is the Big Five-based system from Taiwan. So we had about 13,000 Chinese characters in our system. And this was originally under the so-called Big Five system. But because it was a commercial product, so actually the Big Five system Hong Kong uses is called the Yitian Big Five, which has extended characters. I will show you some examples later. There are some symbols and components, etc. The problem with using someone else's system is that they are not designed for you. So there are some characters which Hong Kong needs to use, but they are not supplied under the Big Five system. And I gave you some examples in here. This is the character used by HSBC. We call it Hong Kong Bank. They actually use a Chinese variant created for themselves. That character is not in Big Five. And also because of some companies registered in Hong Kong, they are from mainland. Some of the simplified characters appeared in the company's registry, and so they need to be supported in Hong Kong, and so you see these simplified Chinese characters. There are also Cantonese unique characters, phonetic in nature. And we all know there are Chinese character variants, which can be written, with a different kind of position. And this happens to be one of them, which was not supported in Hong Kong, but used somehow by people in Hong Kong. And there are also foreign characters. And this particular case is supposed to be a Japanese horse name because Hong Kong has this horse racing tradition. So they have horses coming from different places. The Japanese horses has the Han characters. And so, and I noticed that this character was not standardized in Japan either. So I'm not sure how they supported it. But that's the situation in Hong Kong before we had our own standard. The Hong Kong government in 1995 started to require suppliers, computer suppliers, to support a so-called government common character set. This is a group of 3,000 some characters which are collected within the Hong Kong government's different departments. For example, if I register my ID, I have to pay for tax, and they need to know among themselves so they know that they're referring to the same person. Originally, the GCCS was intended for internal use, so they put it under the so-called user-defined area of Big Five. Big Five, in its design, was not designed to have future extensions. So they leave one area open for people to define their own characters, and this is where these characters was defined. And Eventually, because of the computerization in Hong Kong, Hong Kong government is under pressure of making all these information available to the public. So in 1997, Hong Kong government provided this set of characters to the public for download because under Big Five system, you can add the font. If you have the input methods, you should be able to use it. So in a way, this is where Hong Kong government start to go public. This is not really the standardization yet. The problem with GCCS is that it's not official. Government made it available, but it's not really an official document. The government cannot explain how those characters get into that collection. There are also mistakes in the GCCS. For example, if you look at this character, this was in GCCS, but the character was already in Big Five. The problem with these characters was they were accepted at the time by maybe a low-ranking officer dealing with the public, their customers. Say if they want to register their name. If the guy is not familiar with the system, he cannot find the character through input methods. He would think that this is a new character. And that's why some of these characters were introduced by mistake. So after the handover in 1997, the government started with a so-called Digital 21 strategy, on the IT strategy, where they opened up, they set up a committee and wants to provide some kind of a technology guidelines on the open and common use of the Chinese language. So this particular Chinese language interface task under the Digital 21 had a committee. And one of the IT strategy is to migrate from a Big Five platform to an ISO 10646 or the Unicode platform. The reason is that the Unicode platform is a superset of Big Five, but it can entertain more characters, and it has formal methods of extending it if you have new characters coming into place. So under this strategy, the government started the actual standardization process. In fact, during this process, an additional 3,000 some candidates was sort of used as an input for reviewing the collection. The Hong Kong government had an internal organization, but considering the limited space under Big Five, which I will mention a little bit later, the government has set up a so-called inclusion-exclusion criteria. So in May 1999, this Chinese Language Interface Advisory Committee was set up. I was one of the members. And then the first Hong Kong, actually, in terms of IT, that's probably one of the first IT standard was published in September 28. And it's called the Hong Kong Supplementary Character Set. Supplement meaning that the characters included in Big Five would not be part of this set. If you take a look at, as a summary, the HKSCS in its first version has 4,700 some characters. And there are Cantonese unique characters. There are also some other characters which we can verify their sources from major dictionaries. There are also some other scientific names, new materials and things like that. There are also some personal names that we consider, they are widely circulated, like, for example, we use this example in China. Prime Minister Zhu Rongji, his Rong was not in GB standard in China, so they have to include it because he's so often being referenced. The same thing in Hong Kong. We have a legislative councillor. Her name was widely used in the newspapers, but it was not standardized, not in any standard. So those are included. There are also, if you look at the characters, there are also, we call them radicals or components of Chinese characters. They were originated actually from eating Big Five. This was not a Hong Kong invention, but because they were there already, so they are also included. Also, there are special symbols, like the pinyin symbols. We have a complete pinyin symbols in HKSCS. We also have some phonetic symbols. This is the international phonetic, alphabet. There are also stroke symbols, the hiragana, katakana, and you notice there are some graphic symbols for borders and things. There's also electrical symbols for the ground line, and this is probably, I'm not quite sure, but this is a resistor or something. Okay. We also included the Russian alphabet. This is just to be consistent with GB 2312, I think. Okay. Don't worry about the numbers. The point is, when setting up HKSCS, we have to face a limited space. In Big Five system, the areas where you can extend characters are under the so-called user-defined area 1, user-defined area 2, and user-defined area 3. Under the first version of Hong Kong HKSCS, UDC1, UDA2 are all fully occupied. So at the design stage, we split UDA3 into two parts. One part, the specific code doesn't really matter. This is the part where the Hong Kong government has published or restricted itself from using it, leaving it as a private use area, meaning that the government promised in all its future extensions they will not touch this area. This, gives other users a way of creating their own symbols, because if we occupy the whole area and everybody downloads the HKSCS in Hong Kong, then nobody can create their own symbols. So this was designed at the beginning to prevent further blockage of the area. Now, filling up all the 4,000-some characters, in fact, there were only 465 code points left. So there's a very limited space for extension. And this was also one of the reasons that Hong Kong government wants to migrate to ISO 10646 eventually, because we know we don't have enough place forever. For the collection of characters, we had some exclusion principles. Obviously, if you find it in Big Five, you should not recode it. This is, you have to avoid it for all coding standards. Also, For Chinese characters, we all know there are variations of characters which are fundamentally the same. So if there are two characters which are basically the same, when saying basically the same, it's very vague. So what we do is we use ISO 10646, so-called unification rules, where under ISO, if you consider two characters cannot be given two separate code, they are called unifiable characters, and they should not be included. So if you look at the pictures over here, this is, the bag, and in this particular case, this one does not go all the way up, and under ISO, this is considered unifiable characters. So we don't want to separately code them, and that's why this character is in the standard, but this one is not. Okay, so we went through this formal process. There are also some characters in the original GCCS government collection, but we cannot find their source, so they are not verifiable characters. So at the end, after the discussion with experts, those characters are officially being removed from the published HKSCS. The issue is, from a technical viewpoint, if you already have a standard and the code point is reserved for some character, you can, supposedly, you should never reclaim that code point for some other characters. No matter how wrong they are, if someone else is using that with a defined purpose and you overwrite it with something else, you can create data inconsistency. So because of that, we removed the character in principle. However, we did not reclaim the code point for those characters. And so this provides a flexibility for vendors. If they want to, they can still generate or produce the characters in the wrong shape. We try to block the use of those code by preventing people creating the input methods for these characters. But if they really want to, they know that this is the character they use, they can use internal code to access to those characters. Fortunately, for those removed characters, we have never received any complaints after the HKSCS was published. So it was a good decision. And if you look at the character I mentioned at the beginning, this is supposed to be a removed one. If you look at the font for the qing or the dark blue color, on the bottom of it, the glyph is a little bit different from the normal way we write it. Supposedly, it's like a moon with two horizontal strokes. But in the original one, this was one vertical one and one horizontal one. And that under ISO 10646 is unifiable. And that's why they are not being coded. So there are removal of another character. As an example, I showed the code table in here. Now, to facilitate the migration into the Unicode platform, so in the government standard, when you have a character, and if you look at this table, this shows FA40, FA41, and that's their Big Five code. And you notice this is a simplified Chinese. Did I mention about the inclusion rule? And in that case, you look at these characters. In the government standard, we provided the mapping into Unicode because Unicode was also at the time being developed. So we have the mapping into Unicode under Unicode version 2, under Unicode version 3. So now we also have more. This was the original one. At the time, there was only Unicode 3 version. And you'll notice that this particular character under Unicode version 3 is formally being coded. And this one was still under Unicode, the private use area. And I just add an additional information here to show you where these characters might be from. This is a Cantonese character, so it's not from Kangxi Dictionary. This is a Kangxi Dictionary character. Somehow was not included in Big Five. So you see these are from Kangxi. This is not from Kangxi. And this is, in Japan and in Korea, they use character in this shape. And this character, actually the source, from an electronic coding standard, this actually came from Korea. That's what I can double check. So provision of these tables would help the vendors to make conversions if they want to when they move to Unicode platform. You remember this was published in 1999, when the Unicode platform was not as popular. Now all the Windows system use Unicode platform. Apple has been using Unicode platform for the longest time, so that mapping was important. Now, for any extension of HKSCS, it was the government decided to let the advisory committee to handle all the new inclusions. So a public consultation was published on the inclusion procedure, the inclusion and exclusion rules. I've mentioned this one. Now, one of the things is that we have decided not to include any more simplified characters, purely because of its size limitation. Because the simplified Chinese which were there were included to provide backward compatibility, not because we want to include all of them. So if there's no need, of course, we would not include it. But because of the limit in space, simplified Chinese would not be included anymore. The inclusion rules, and you can see one of the things is that it has to be commonly used in Hong Kong. And this is a character, this is Shen Shui Bu, one of the places, a very popular place in Hong Kong. So it's it's a place name. And for this character, this is supposedly the way many people write, but in Hong Kong, this is a very popular kind of a glyph that people like to use. And so, because they are already being published or being used either in the newspaper or in some art form, and so they are being included. The Cantonese characters like this obviously are Cantonese unique, so they can be included. And the other type that we include are personal names, building names. For these, they have to be, in a way, in dictionaries somewhere. These are just some examples. Just to be on the safe side, there may be scientific discoveries of new material and things, Chinese characters do get created. So we have these special symbols, but they have to be, they have to justify that they are being used in Hong Kong. Common or not common is not counted by the number of people, but at least they are used in Hong Kong. Also, there is a promise of a review process of no more than 3 months to send it back to whoever requested. and there's a separate submission for government internal bodies or external, for example, individuals or organization, scholars, individual person, or newspaper when they have all of these needs. Since then, HKSCS had 3 more extensions, and I just list them here for your information. 2 years later, the standard was published with an additional 100-some characters, and then 3 years later, another 100-some characters, and then 4 years later, actually this was published, even though it's written as 2008, but it was published in 2009 with only 68-some characters. So you can see that there is a trend for reduction because in this case, the period is longer, even though the number of characters is more. So there is a total of 300-some characters included to the latest version of HKSCS. In fact, HSCS has already stopped its development under Big Five platform. Conceptually, there is a separation of inclusion of Hong Kong unique characters from the coding standard. Because of the Big Five's limit in space and less people would be using the Big Five platform, this was a decision made by the Hong Kong government that once all the previous included characters are being standardized under the Unicode or ISO 106 standards, then the Hong Kong government will stop giving code points to new characters in Big Five, meaning that nowadays, if you want to have a character to be included in HKSCS, you have to prove that it is not in Unicode, rather than to say that it's not in Big Five. Okay, so there is no Big Five support anymore. Basically, the government had, during all this period, not only providing the extensions, the procedures to the characters, and also at the same time working with the vendors to make sure these character fonts, their corresponding input methods, are provided for free. And they can be downloadable through the web. This is particularly true for the Big Five-based systems. I noticed that under the Windows 7, that Microsoft has to do this by themselves. The government no longer can do that anymore. So right now, there is no more characters being extended into Big Five anymore. Okay? To conclude, the HKSCS is the first government standard issued in Hong Kong in terms of IT. There was another unofficial one in terms of telegraph coding, but it was a partial list requested by the Chinese government at the time. So the government has played a very important leading role in Hong Kong in terms of doing the standardization. If you all know that Hong Kong, coming from a colonial background, in the past, they were not willing to play a leading role in many things. So this was one of the very good things that the Hong Kong government did. So over the last about 15 years or so time, there are 4 versions of HKSCS being published, and it's already sort of finished its role, and now Hong Kong has successfully migrated into the ISO conforming platforms. And that's the end of my talk. Okay.